In this video, we'll look at the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant from the election of 1868, and we'll get up to the election of 1876, although that election is important, and I'm going to include it in a subsequent video. Grant let it be known that he would not interfere with the radical Republicans in Congress from basically having control of the Reconstruction, and so Grant administration is considered part of congressional Reconstruction, which I've discussed in a previous video. His real name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, and he was born in 1822 in Ohio to an ardent anti-slavery family. He showed an amazing ability riding horses, and he maintained that his entire life. He secured an appointment to West Point, where they mistakenly recorded his name as Ulysses S. Grant. And that mistake stuck, and people joked that he was U.S. Grant, or sometimes they referred to him as Sam, as in Uncle Sam Grant. Grant married Julia Dent, the daughter of a pro-South slave owner, which created tremendous tension within the family. In time, they had 4 children. Here you can see a picture of Grant as a very young man on the left, and with a bit later when he was president, with his family, who's obviously grown up. Grant served in the Mexican-American War. He wasn't as high-ranking or as known as Robert E. Lee. But he served well, but just not in any type of distinguished way. And afterwards, the Army sent him to the West Coast. And out there, he was absent from his family, and his drinking increased. And Grant struggled with alcoholism his entire life. Matter of fact, when he was with his Army, he had an assistant that job was to try to keep him from drinking. But he was out west clearly unhappy and wasn't happy with the way he was advancing in the military. And he ended up resigning from the Army, and he moved to Missouri to end up near Julia's family. And there they built a small cabin, the family aptly named Hardscrabble, and you can see a picture of it there. So Grant worked as sort of a small farmer and a few other occupations, but this was sort of a down point in his life. In 1860, he moved to Galena, Illinois, and worked in a leather goods store with some relatives. And when the Civil War began, he, of course, had been his West Point credentials. They were forming the Illinois militia, and he joined that and was appointed to leadership capacity and was sent out to the Western Theater. And, of course, you know what happened there. He was a great general. But up until the time of the Civil War, his life was undistinguished. As president, Grant supported the 15th Amendment, which was proposed in 1869 and ratified in 1870, in part because of the activities of the Klan. The 15th Amendment officially and unambiguously gave African Americans the right to vote. Clearly, they already had that right in things like the 14th Amendment, but this is just stating it more forcibly, and it's difficult to to deny them the vote with this amendment on the books in any way. Given the activities of the Klan, Grant signed the Ku Klux Klan Acts of 1870 and 1871. The new laws allowed for federal prosecutors, not state prosecutors, to prosecute Klan criminal activity. It also allowed for the president to suspend habeas corpus, that's due process, it's Latin body of law, wherever the Klan activity was great, and use the Army also to arrest the offending Klan members. Grant went after the Klan forcibly after passage of the new laws, and he even declared a state of emergency in 9 South Carolina counties. He did suspend habeas corpus, and he arrested hundreds of Klan suspects. By the end of his presidency, over 3,000 Southerners had been prosecuted for violating the civil rights of freedmen, and the Klan was effectively crushed. So a lot of times a lot of historians have said that Grant was kind of clueless and just followed the lead of the radical Republicans in Congress. More revisionist historians have pointed out that Klan destruction and Grant gets a lot of credit for that, as he should. As Grant's first term passed, the economy began slowly to boom after the initial recovery from the war, and there were expansion of railroads and the rebuilding of things, and that means there's opportunity for money. But an example of the booming country was the completion in 1869 of the Transcontinental Railroad, where the two companies working toward each other met at Promontory Point in Utah, shown here. You can see the two locomotives sort of facing each other, and all the workers on either side, each company, and the two investors holding hands. If you look carefully, you can see them exchanging champagne glasses off the locomotives. They had been working ever since Lincoln had signed the Railroad Act during earlier in the Civil War. And so all through the Civil War, this construction had been going on. The two companies were working towards each other, as I say. The Central Pacific under Leland Stanford, and you can see a picture of them there, and that's for whom Stanford University is named, great school, had been working eastward towards, from Sacramento. And they employed a great number of Chinese immigrants who had arrived on the new clipper ships, the clipper ships being the faster ships that could cross the Pacific. And so he had a lot of cheap labor. And in time, there'll be anti-Chinese sentiment, racist sentiment on the West Coast, but that's for a story for another day. The Central Pacific, moving eastward from Sacramento, had a tougher time because it immediately had to go through the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains. And this, of course, meant you had to build bridges and you had to blast your way through tunnels. And so progress is going to be a bit slower. The company working westward from Omaha was the Union Pacific Railroad Company. And it had a quicker time moving initially because it was going across the plains. It was flat. They had to deal with the Indians, but they're both going to keep working, as I say, all the way to 1869 when they met at Promontory Point. I just can't overemphasize the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad. It would take you, months to cross from the east to the west before, and it was very dangerous. And now you could hop on a railroad and be there only in a matter of days. And it was much more comfortable, obviously. And with the telegraph, we were really sort of knitting the whole country into one. And all of this, create opportunity and help the economy recover. In this period, one notable thing that Grant did was he signed legislation creating the Department of Justice. I'm making this video in 2020. And so it says the Department of Justice here celebrating 150 years. It was founded in 1870. I should add as well that in 1867, just before Grant took office, the U.S. government had purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, or about 2 cents an acre. It was, certainly in our view, but truly in the end, a brilliant move, of course, by then Secretary of State William Seward. Nevertheless, despite the improving economy by the Grant administration, attempts to profit from its resources had been failures. It was too distant. Many people during Grant administration still referred to it as Seward's folly. It really wasn't until a civil government was first established there in 1884 and gold was discovered in 1896 that Seward's folly was seen for the brilliant move it was. So there were a lot of positive things from the Grant administration. He was cracking down on the KKK, and the economy was doing okay, and it was Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, and Alaska had been purchased, which would in the end prove a very profitable thing. But nevertheless, Grant had some problems that were developing as well. By the end of his first term, Grant faced charges of corruption as several scandals rocked his administration. None of these ever directly involved Grant, but only subordinates. Grant remained a scrupulously an honest man, but the scandals did, however, tarnish his image and gave Democrats a needed political talking point. Politically, Republicans were still waving the proverbial bloody shirt. That was reminding voters that the Democrats had been the party of rebellion. Here you see a cartoon of kind of mocking Grant about his scandals. He's taking advantage of the government cake. Probably the most infamous of the Grant scandals in the late 1860s and early 1870s was the infamous Black Friday gold conspiracy in 1869. It involved two speculators, Jay Gould on the right and Jim Fisk on the left, trying to corner the gold market and drive the price of gold up, which they had hoarded. You may recall that during the war, in order to pay for the war, the federal government had gone off the gold standard. So no longer could you take banknotes and exchange them at the bank for gold or other precious metals on a ratio to gold. And the government had also begun to print its first paper money, which they called greenbacks. And so there was these greenbacks and a lot of currency, still specie coins around, and a lot of currency, which helped the government pay for the war. Well, after the war, Grant had begun to release gold from the Treasury, and that continued to be, and an economic stimulus, which was what Grant wanted to do. But what Gould and Fisk decided to do was corner the market on gold artificially. And what they did was they formed some companies, and these companies would buy up the gold when Grant released them. The price would be low because more gold would be released. And no one knew that they'd be hoarding it. Well, they would then convince Grant through his brother-in-law to that inflation was a problem, and he should stop selling gold. And when he did that, of course, the price of gold would begin to rise, and they would have all this gold stocked up, so they would benefit. And when the price got high enough, they would suddenly dump it, and then Gould and Fisk would have made a huge profit. Well, what ended up happening was Grant finally caught on to it when the price of gold was real high, and he decided to resume selling gold. And he started doing that on Black Friday. It was called Black Friday not because it didn't break the conspiracy, which it did, but it plummeted the price of gold, and a lot of investors lost money. But the whole Black Friday gold conspiracy sort of tarnished Grant. Here's a blackboard used to tabulate gold prices in the gold exchange during the Black Friday conspiracy, and a cartoon showing Fisk on it, kind of mocking him. Another scandal that sort of rocked the Grant administration was the so-called Credit Mobilier scandal. This involved the railroads, and it actually happened before Grant took office, but it sort of became public during his presidency. Some of the leaders of the Union Pacific Railroad, of course, that company was booming. It had to build a lot of railroads, and so it needed a lot of construction work. And what they ended up doing secretly was they formed a construction company known as the Credit Mobilier Company, and then they gave all the business to build the railroad to the Credit Mobilier Construction Company. Of course, they were paying the Credit Mobilier fees that were way beyond the actual the cost of building the railroad. And so when the Union Pacific paid the Credit Mobilier, what they were doing was they were lining the pockets of these Union Pacific leaders. And to keep this scandal going, they would pay off members of the government with Credit Mobilier stock. And this eventually became known. Grant wasn't involved, but once again, it sort of added to the sense that the government that he was leading was just corrupt. There was other scandals. I mean, there was in St. Louis a whiskey ring scandal where distillers bribed tax collectors to bilk the government of millions in revenue. That one involved Grant's private secretary, who took large sums of money and other valuables in return for inside information to keep the scam going. There were still other sort of scandals. The Secretary of War, it turned out, had accepted bribes from merchants who trade with Indians at army posts in the West. He was impeached, but he resigned in time to elude a Senate trial. Post office contracts, it was also revealed, went to carriers who offered the highest kickback. Again, there's no evidence that Grant himself was ever involved in or that he personally profited from any of this fraud. He was a scrupulously honest man. But let's face it, he made a number of poor choices in his associates, and it all kind of added to the image of his administration as being kind of corrupt. When Grant ran for re-election in 1872, he won the Republican nomination, but dissident Republicans who thought he'd been too tough on the South and was vulnerable to charges of corruption decided to split and run their own ticket, dubbed the Liberal Republicans. They then nominated the newspaperman and former Congressman Horace Greeley, who you can see here on the right. Democrats believed that Greeley was their only chance to defeat Grant, so they just held their own convention and nominated the same ticket, Greeley, as the Liberal Republicans' ticket. Grant, however, remained a national hero, and people sensed that he was honest even if he couldn't choose decent, subordinates. Grant ended up easily defeating Greeley and several other small party candidates in the 1872 election. Grant's second term was troubled like his first. With the Civil War greenbacks still in circulation and with inflation threatening, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1873. No longer would the government mint silver coins, and it would stop printing new greenbacks. With the subsequent Resumption Act of 1875, the country went one step further, officially returning to the gold standard, meaning that a person could exchange any paper money for gold. tightening the monetary system, which all of this did, angered those who depended upon easy credit from banks, such as farmers and those in the South and the West. And they called all of this the crime of 1873. Here you can see a cartoon, a gold conquering silver. Silver's no longer going to be minted, and we're going back on the gold standard. With a tighter monetary system, less money easily available to borrow, investors were of course nervous. Also, the booming economy had led to a stock market bubble, especially in industries such as railroads. In 1873, the prominent banker J. Cook suddenly announced that he was bankrupt. Cook had worked with Secretary of Treasury Chase during the Civil War. It was really prominent, and when he went bankrupt, it shocked people who then began to sell their stocks because they were worried. People began to also demand their money in gold, and many banks didn't have enough gold to cover it. They went bankrupt. This all led to a 5-year economic downturn that lasted into throughout the remainder of Grant's term and became known as the Panic of 1873. Until the Great Depression of the 1930s, it was known as one of the country's worst economic downturns in its history. To make matters even worse, as the Klan crumbled, new Southern resistance groups soon formed, such as the White League. In New Orleans in 1874, several thousand White League members seized the government before Grant used the military to restore order. By this point, all of this, the economic and monetary problems, the ongoing corruption, and the apparently never-ending violence, had led to a sense that the federal government had done enough already. People were just tired of all this effort. With every passing year, the Civil War was another year in the past, and waving the bloody shirt wasn't working as well, and the Democratic Party had been growing in power. Accordingly, federal troops had increasingly been withdrawn from the South. This, of course, had ominous ramifications for the freedmen who lived there. Without federal troops to protect them, Southerners again could use force to try to deny freedmen their rights. To Southerners, however, this process of federal troops withdrawing had been way too slow. To them, no U.S. troops was a positive development, obviously, and they termed this process of federal troops withdrawing and redemption. And when the federal troops are gone, these Southerners could once again crack down on the freedmen, take charge of the local and state government, seize power, and in their view, they had redeemed the land, hence redemption. Southerners, once again in power, were known as the Redeemers, and here's a cartoon showing them conquering in the end, these Redeemers. Contributing to Southern redemption was a very conservative Supreme Court, which met in a room in the U.S. Capitol now known as the Old Supreme Court Chamber, and you can see above. It really wasn't until about 1930s that they began building a separate chamber for the U.S. Supreme Court, the one we know today. Anyway, the Supreme Court weakened the 14th and 15th Amendments and in the process declared that while the federal government can intervene if a state prohibited voting rights, it was the state's responsibility to intervene if an individual violated those rights. Since in the end all violations were committed by individual people, the ruling effectively weakened federal prosecutions. The redeemed states would of course never prosecute. By the 1876 election, the so-called redemption of the South was almost complete. As the election approached, Grant thought about seeking a third term, but Republicans were ready to move on given all that had transpired, and the two-term president set by George Washington was kind of a high bar to break. In his latter years, Grant would again make bad business decisions and suffer from corruption. This time he lost most of his family's money. He was saved only by writing and selling his memoirs, which you can see him doing now, and he ended up dying of throat cancer. And on the picture on the right, you can see him covering the right side of his head, which is a big lump of the throat cancer. But by the way, his memoirs got a lot of money and were helped negotiated by Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain. In any event, this concludes the video on Grant's two-term Reconstruction and presidency, and I'm going to conclude Reconstruction era by talking about the 1876 election in the next video.